G'day, Dave here, and we're looking at Matthew chapters 1 and 2. That's right, we're going to go back and we're going to look at them again because I've glossed over some stuff. Now, when I was a student at university, I used to gloss over everything I could, and whenever there were quotes or footnotes, I'd ignore them. Now, what we see in Matthew 1 and 2 are 5 references by Matthew, 5 quotes or references back into the Old Testament to help us to understand the context and who Jesus is and how he fits into God's plans and purposes. Because Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus isn't coming into a vacuum. He's coming in fulfillment of what God had already planned. Now, I want to explain this as we look at each of the passages. First one being in chapter 1 and verses 22 and 23. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, there's a reference here back to Isaiah chapter 7, and particularly verse 14. But you can see a connection if you read through Isaiah 7 right through to chapter 11. Because here are promises. Now, the promise is made to a virgin. First of all, that she will conceive and give birth to a child. That's remarkable enough. But the point here is Matthew saying, no, it's not remarkable. It was promised, and now it's taking place. But what is extraordinary, even above being born to a virgin, is who it is who's born, and that is God with us. And God had promised that would happen. So you go back to Isaiah, written in the 8th century BC, and there it all is. And Jesus is fulfilling what was promised. That's the first thing. Second thing, turn the page, well for me I do, into chapter 2, verse 5. The Herod is asking where the teacher of the law think the Messiah is going to be born. And they say quite clearly, in Jerusalem in Judea. For this is what the prophet has written. It's not that the teachers of the law or the chief priests had some kind of magical insight. No, they just read their Bibles. And it takes them to the book of Micah, chapter 5. And so they quote, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Now again, this helps us to understand that Jesus is coming according to plan. Now, it's not a plan that you would anticipate. If Jesus was going to come to rule, to be the king, you'd expect him to come to Jerusalem. But instead, he comes to Bethlehem, a small town 8 kilometres down the road. But this is what was promised. Here is God keeping his promise. It's there back in Micah again, about 8th century BC. This is it. And then there are 3 more promises that are not so much this is this, but a type or a framework or a pattern that's being worked out when it comes to Jesus. Let me explain. Chapter 2 and verse 15. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now, where does that come from? I look down at the bottom of the page. Footnote says Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And if I go back to Hosea, I read that it's talking about Israel. Israel were known as God's son, and they come out of Egypt. Now, Israel coming out of Egypt was the big event for most of the Old Testament, because it was there that God rescued his people, he redeemed his people, he ransomed his people, and they celebrated that every year since, still today, for strict Jews. That is the Passover. God rescued his people through the Passover, and he brought them to be his own people. Now, that's the saving event. That's where God rescued his people. And I take it what it's saying is, if you want to understand what's going on with Jesus, then you need to see him in the light of the Exodus, where God brings his people out of. They exodus Egypt to be God's people. Here is another event, a saving event, a salvation event, but this time with Jesus. And again, where do you find that? Back well and truly before Jesus. And then, verse 17, then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they were no more. Now, the first of those two quotes, back in Hosea, references the Exodus. This one actually references the exile. Now, I know, because I used to get confused, that many people get confused between the Exodus and the exile. They both start with X, literally EX, that is. What's the difference? Well, many, many years later, after the kingdom of David has been established, and then all of the kings after him are corrupt and they're evil and they keep disappointing God and they keep turning the people away from God, God has had enough. And so he brings the Babylonians in and they destroy Jerusalem, they flatten the temple, they tear down the walls, and they take the people of God from Judah captive into Babylon. And there's a lot of weeping when that happens. And it's a picture here of the matriarch, Rachel, weeping for her children as they are walking into exile. But the quote comes from Jeremiah 31. And if you read that quote very carefully, you'll discover that this is a chapter which doesn't simply point out the desolation and disaster of God's people being cut off from all of their promises and their homeland. No, this sparks new hope. Jeremiah 31 talks of a time when God will again rescue his people. A second Exodus, if you like, another saving event. And this is the context in which we're to understand Jesus. The Exodus and the exile. There's the framework. Twice when God's people are cut off and he brings them and saves them. This is what he's doing now with Jesus. And the last of these references, well, we go down to verse 23. And he went and he lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he will be called a Nazarene. And this is a little trickier to work out because my understanding is that you won't find a prophecy or a particular quote behind this. It's not that there was one prophet or one writing predicting that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. But rather, and I offer this to you as a suggestion, there may be a play on words. That is, the branch was part of God's promise back in Isaiah chapters 7 through to 11. God said that out of Jesse, and Jesse was David's father, a stump would grow up, and out of that a branch would come forth and produce fruit. And there's a picture there of God's coming Messiah, of his king reigning and ruling and blessing the nations. And the word for branch is Nezer. And it might well be that there's this play on words, that Nezer gives rise to the town Nazareth. And Nezer gives rise to the word Nazarene. And so again, there's a link to Jesus being the promised one, the one who would come. But even if we haven't got that right, there's something quite particular, I think, about Nazareth. And that is Nazareth in Galilee. It was considered to be, well, a less than pure place. They were multicultural. They had all kinds of different ethnic backgrounds. They weren't strictly Jewish. They weren't the place to go if you were going to get a pure blood Messiah. Now, we're told about Jesus' pedigree back in chapter 1. But we know from other Gospels that people ask such questions as, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Matthew's answer is, yep, Jesus. Jesus comes out of Nazareth. And maybe here, right at the beginning, once again, he's identifying with those who are sinners. He's identifying not only with the Jews, but with the nations, with the Gentiles. Now, friends, what do we make of this? Well, let me suggest three things. The first is method. Let's read the Bible carefully. Don't use shortcuts. Don't gloss over. Take your time. If there's something that doesn't make sense, read over it and read it again. Come back to it if need be. And if you see direct quotes, like the ones we've got in this passage, don't skip over them. Track them down. Go back and read the verse, but read the verse in the chapter, and even better, read the whole book that's behind it. Because the more we read of the Bible, the more other parts of the Bible make sense. And the more we dig into the scriptures, the more we'll understand Jesus. That's the first thing, method. Second thing is the message. And I think the overwhelming message of Matthew 1 and 2 is that God had a plan and he's kept it. And that plan is climaxing in Jesus. And again and again and again, no matter what road you follow, whether it's the genealogy or whether it's these 5 kind of references to different parts of the Old Testament, you see the faithfulness of God keeping his promises. So the method and the message, and then finally the meaning. See, this isn't simply academic. No, this is real, and this is for you and for me. Because if God can be trusted, then we need to place our trust in him. If this is God come in the flesh, then we need to see that Jesus is no ordinary person. If we realize that God is bringing about another saving event in the light of the Exodus and the exile, but this one a spiritual rescue for all eternity, then we'd be mad to ignore it. So the meaning, I take it, we look closely and we see again that Jesus is God among us, Emmanuel. He is Jesus who's come to save his people from their sins. Not an accidental hero, but somebody who's fulfilling the purposes of God.